Everyone who has ever given you financial advice has told you to build an emergency fund covering 6 months of expenses. What almost none of them told you is why 6 months, specifically, and not 3 or 4 or 8. The number gets repeated so often that it stops sounding like a calculation and starts sounding like a commandment. But there is an actual mechanism behind that number, and it has almost nothing to do with emergencies at all. Here's the thing nobody says out loud. Most people who build a 6-month emergency fund never touch it for an emergency. They keep it sitting there for years, sometimes decades, and the car repairs, the medical bills, the unexpected expenses all get absorbed by their regular paycheck the way they always were. So if the fund isn't really there for emergencies, what is it actually doing? I want you to picture something for the rest of this video, because we're coming back to it more than once. Think of your financial life as a pipe carrying pressure. Every job you can't leave, every bad deal you can't walk away from, every unfair situation you tolerate because you have no alternative. All of that is pressure building inside the pipe, with nowhere to go. A pressure valve doesn't eliminate the pressure. It gives it somewhere to release before the whole system fails. Your 6-month fund isn't a bandage for disasters, it's a pressure valve for decisions. And once you understand that distinction, you'll never look at that number the same way again. Let's talk about why 6 months specifically, because the reasoning is more interesting than most people realize. 3 months covers you through a fast job search in a healthy market. 6 months covers you through a slow one, through negotiations that stall, through a business deal that needs more time than expected to develop properly. It's not a random buffer against chaos. It's roughly the amount of time it takes for a genuine negotiation, of almost any kind, to fully play out without you needing to cave early because your bank account is running dry. Consider a man I'll call Marcus. Marcus ran a small design studio, 3 employees, decent revenue, nothing spectacular. For 2 years, he split project work with a much larger agency that acted as his primary referral source. The arrangement was profitable, but the terms were entirely dictated by the agency. They took 40% of every referred project's value, they set the deadlines, and whenever Marcus pushed back on scope creep, the agency would casually mention that they had 2 other studios they could route work to instead. Marcus absorbed the terms every single time, not because they were fair, but because losing that referral pipeline would have meant missing payroll within about 6 weeks. Marcus had heard the 6-month emergency fund advice for years and had always treated it as something for personal disasters, not business ones. But over about 14 months, mostly by redirecting a slow trickle of surplus revenue rather than any dramatic overhaul, he built up enough business reserves to cover his studio's full operating costs, payroll included, for just over 6 months. He didn't do this because he expected the agency relationship to collapse. He did it because a mentor had once told him, offhand, that negotiating leverage and cash runway are the same thing measured in different units. Then, at the 2-year mark, the agency proposed a new contract. Same 40% cut, but now with a clause requiring exclusivity, meaning Marcus's studio couldn't take on any direct clients that might compete with the agency's own roster. In the old version of this story, Marcus signs it, because 6 weeks of runway doesn't survive a standoff with your biggest revenue source. But this time, Marcus told them he needed 2 weeks to review the terms with his team. The agency's account manager, visibly surprised, said that was fine, take your time. During those 2 weeks, Marcus did something he'd never had room to do before. He called 4 other referral partners he'd been quietly maintaining loose relationships with, and within 10 days, 2 of them offered him meaningfully better terms. One at a 30% cut, with no exclusivity clause at all. Marcus went back to his original agency, not with threats, but with a simple statement of fact. He said the exclusivity clause didn't work for his business, and he'd need to keep the relationship non-exclusive, or he'd need to explore other options. The agency dropped the clause within 4 days. Nothing about Marcus's skill changed in those 2 weeks. Nothing about his studio's quality changed. What changed was that the 6-month runway converted a theoretical negotiation into a real one. Below that runway, every one of his objections was a bluff, and the agency almost certainly sensed it, the way anyone senses when the person across the table has no actual alternative. Above it, the objection carried weight, because it was backed by something real. This is the part that most personal finance content skips entirely. The emergency fund isn't primarily insurance against disaster. It's the thing that makes your walkaway option credible in every negotiation you're currently inside, whether that's with a business partner, an employer, a landlord, or anyone else who benefits from you having no alternative. A credible option to leave changes how the other side behaves, often before you've said a single confrontational word. Let's go back to the pressure valve for a moment, because there's a specific mechanic worth understanding. A pressure valve doesn't need to release anything to do its job. Its entire function is that the system knows it's there. Engineers will tell you that a properly rated valve can sit completely unused for the entire lifespan of a piece of machinery and still be doing critical work the whole time. Because its presence changes how much pressure the operators are willing to let build up in the first place. Your 6-month fund works the same way inside a negotiation. You may never touch it. That was never really the point. Its function is that everyone at the table, consciously or not, is calibrating their offer against the fact that you have somewhere else to go. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable, because it applies just as directly to employment as it does to business partnerships. Consider the position of someone with 2 weeks of savings versus someone with 6 months, both sitting across from the same difficult manager, both facing the same unreasonable request. The person with 2 weeks will almost always comply, not because the request is reasonable, but because pushing back risks a confrontation they cannot financially survive if it goes badly. The person with 6 months can say no calmly and mean it. The manager, whether they'd admit it or not, generally reads the difference. People who can afford to lose the argument tend to win more of them. This is why the 6-month number specifically matters more than 3 or 4. Most negotiations that actually require leverage, whether renegotiating a contract, pushing back on unreasonable work demands, or restructuring a bad business relationship, take longer to resolve than most people expect. A 3-month cushion gets you through the first uncomfortable conversation. It does not get you through the actual back-and-forth that follows, the counteroffers, the cooling-off periods, the moments where the other side tests whether you'll fold under a longer wait. 6 months is closer to the real timeline of a negotiation that has any complexity to it at all. There's a reason financial advisors rarely frame it this way, and it's worth naming directly. An emergency fund, framed purely as disaster insurance, is easy to sell and easy to justify. An emergency fund, framed as negotiating leverage, requires admitting something less comfortable, which is that most people are underpaid, overcommitted, or stuck in unfavorable arrangements, specifically because they cannot afford to say no. That's a harder truth to put in a pamphlet, so it mostly doesn't get said. Let's talk about what happens once you actually cross that 6-month threshold, because the shift is more specific than people expect. It's not that you become reckless or start quitting jobs on a whim. Almost nobody who reaches this point behaves that way. What changes is smaller and more precise. You start asking for things you would have talked yourself out of asking for before. You start pushing back on the second unreasonable request instead of absorbing it silently the way you did the first 5. You start noticing when a deal is genuinely bad instead of assuming that's just how deals work. None of this requires you to actually spend the fund. It only requires that the fund exists, and that you know it exists, and crucially, that the other party can sense that you know. Here's a detail from Marcus's story that's easy to miss, but it matters. He never once mentioned his savings to the agency. He never said, "I have 6 months of runway, so I don't need you." He didn't need to. The confidence that comes from a real alternative shows up in tone, in the length of a pause after a request you disagree with, in the fact that you're willing to let a silence sit, instead of rushing to fill it with concessions. People read that, even when nobody says it explicitly. Desperation has a particular texture, and so does its absence, and both are far more visible to the other side of a negotiation than most people realize. Now, I want to address the obvious objection, because it's a fair one. Not everyone can build 6 months of expenses quickly, and telling someone to do that as if it's a simple checklist item ignores real constraints: debt, income instability, family obligations. All of it. That's true, and it's worth saying plainly. But the reframe still matters even if you're starting from zero, because it changes what you're actually building toward. If you think of the fund purely as disaster insurance, the goalpost feels abstract, and the motivation tends to fade the moment nothing bad happens for a while. If you think of it as the thing that will eventually let you renegotiate the worst arrangement currently sitting in your life, whether that's a job, a lease, or a business relationship, the goalpost becomes concrete, and concrete goals get pursued differently than abstract ones. There's also a sequencing point worth making clearly. You don't need the full 6 months to start seeing this effect. The shift in leverage isn't a light switch that flips only at the finish line. It builds gradually as the runway grows. Someone moving from 2 weeks of savings to 2 months already starts negotiating differently, even if 2 months isn't the final target. The confidence compounds the same way the number does. This means the advice isn't wasted on someone who's nowhere close to 6 months yet. Every additional month of runway shifts the negotiation dynamic a little further in your favor, well before you reach the number most advisors quote as the goal. Let's bring this back to Marcus one more time, because the ending of his story says something worth sitting with. A year after the exclusivity clause was dropped, Marcus's studio had grown enough that the original agency relationship became a minor part of his revenue, rather than the load-bearing wall it once was. He didn't plan that outcome when he started building the fund. He built it because a mentor made an offhand comment about runway and leverage being the same thing. The actual negotiation that changed his business almost didn't happen at all. It happened because, for the first time in 2 years, he had 2 weeks to think instead of 2 days, and 2 weeks was enough time for a genuinely better option to surface. That's the actual mechanism behind the 6-month rule, and it's rarely explained this way. It isn't there to protect you from a catastrophe that statistically may never come. It's there to convert every important negotiation in your life from a bluff into a real hand, whether or not you ever have to show your cards. The pressure valve doesn't need to release anything to be doing its job. It just needs to be sitting there, quietly changing how much pressure everyone around you is willing to let build before they blink first. So if you're currently building toward that 6-month number, or you haven't started yet, here's the reframe worth carrying forward. Stop thinking of it as protection against a disaster that might not happen. Start thinking of it as the specific amount of runway required to turn your next difficult conversation, whichever one that is for you, from something you have to survive into something you actually get to negotiate. The math doesn't change. The number is the same either way, but the reason you're building it changes everything about how you'll actually use it when the moment finally comes.